After I checked out the Corsair 4000D a few weeks ago, I noticed that there was another rival for the most popular PC case that was appearing across multiple retailers, and obviously there was this case. NZXT H5 Flow. It follows NZXT's signature flat and square design that's been apparent since the classic S340 and hasn't gone anywhere since. But most importantly, it keeps pretty much the exact same price. Coming in at just £70 to £80, the NZXT H5 Flow will fit the needs for about 95% of PC builders out there. Replacing the H510, the H5 offers a handful of new things compared to the previous model, as well as a few unfortunate downgrades. This time round, they swapped the hard drive cage for that weird new fan at the front, which is meant to cool down your GPU. But don't worry, you can still mount a single hard drive or two SATA SSDs to this bracket behind the motherboard. The interior is now truly white everywhere, and not black like it used to be on the white version of the H510. And most importantly, we now have support for more than just one fan at the top of the case, so you can finally top mount your 240mm radiator. As for downgrades, there's actually quite a few. For some reason, all of the rear expansion slots are solid, which isn't the case on the H5 Flow RGB version. I have no idea why. Surely it's more hassle to sell two versions with different expansion slots. But anyway, back to the H5 Flow that I have here. Also, the power supply shroud is solid as well, and when combining this with the solid expansion slots, it just seems to trap air around the graphics card. The addition of that basement fan isn't really seeing much benefit, as the hot air from the GPU has nowhere to easily escape, other than from above. The worst part of this new everything must be solid revelation is the fact that they got rid of the little cutout on the power supply shroud, but the GPU cables to poke through, which I always loved about NZXT cases. 90% of the time, it just looks cleaner than finding a way to bend them over or under the GPU from the side of the motherboard. And the final big downgrade in my eyes is the cable management. The H510 had those cool channels and grooves to squeeze your cables into, whether it was your main cable run to the side of the motherboard or around the top and sides of the chassis. There were channels and ties everywhere. Now in the H5 Flow, we just have some random bits of steel folded over here and there, and a couple of Velcro ties. Honestly, it doesn't make a massive difference, as this is still perfectly adequate and I had no issues with what the H5 Flow has to offer. But it's just sad to see a downgrade after NZXT has had such stellar cable management at this price point for the last 5 years or so. But if you're unfamiliar with NZXT cases and what they have to offer, let's jump in and have a closer look at the H5 Flow. The exterior is that usual boxy design, but I'm happy to say that the entire exterior of the case is made of a solid steel. No off-white plastics to be found on the outside, and everything just looks incredibly seamless. I'm pretty sure the only plastic we can find is that fan shroud, and the fans themselves. The front panel is nice and easy to remove if you wish to give it a clean. It's held in place with two pegs at the top of the case and just requires a bit of a pull at the top, and then it will slide up from the bottom. Once removed, the dust filter is easy to access and just slides off the front panel with no issues at all. The Corsair 3000D I reviewed the other week could definitely learn a thing or two here. At the bottom of the case, we now have two easy to remove dust filters, one for the PSU and one for that basement fan. Then up top we have another all-white magnetic dust filter that sits in place really nicely and doesn't show any bulges from the radiator screws. Whilst we're up here, we'll take a look at the I/O as well. You get the classic purple USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A port, a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port for those faster file transfers, and the headphone and microphone jack are combined, but we no longer get the splitter cable that NZXT used to supply. There's no reset or RGB control buttons either, just a simple power button that lights up with a little white ring. The tempered glass panel is held in place with just a single thumb screw at the top, and it sits in a little lip just above the PSU shroud. Once loosening the screw, removing the panel requires quite a strong push with your thumb to come off, and if you feel like it's getting stuck near the front of the case, well, you just have to push harder. There's no tinting on the glass and it's nice and clear, but NZXT still put this stupid sticker on the glass. Why? Just put it on the film! Oh, now we've made it to the most important part of the video. This is where you click that subscribe button down below. All jokes aside, that'd be great. There's more videos like this coming very, very soon. Moving inside, we can have a better look at what we're working with, and the inside of the H5 Flow looks super clean and minimal. We have the classic NZXT cable bar, which you can remove if you wish to make more room for larger motherboards, or if you have some nice cable extensions to show off. Taking a quick look around, there's some nice things to appreciate about this side of the motherboard. We have a little nubbin in the middle which helps align your motherboard into place before screwing it down. At the top, above the motherboard, we don't have multiple little cutouts for random spots on the motherboard. We have one giant hole spanning nearly the entire width of the motherboard, which is great if you're terrible at cable management and you forget to plug something in. You can just poke it in and slide it along. If you top mount your radiator, you'll appreciate just throwing all your cables through randomly and not having to see them. But if you go with an air cooler, you'll likely be able to see what's going on, and you might be a bit annoyed by how much openness there is up there. At the bottom of the motherboard, where you'll be plugging in your fan headers, USBs and so on, there's just two giant gaping holes. They're nice and easy to work with, but they just seem a bit oversized, unless that's where they expect you to route your GPU cable now. I'm not really sure. Another nice touch is the fact that NZXT groups their front panel connectors together to make it super simple to plug into the motherboard, and saves so much grief with those fiddly, horrible little cables we see all too often. Speaking of nice little touches, this tiny little clip above the rear fan, I really like this. It's super simple and just keeps that cable from the rear fan completely out of the way when installing your motherboard. At the front of the case, where you'd expect to find some intake fans, we have nothing but just a big gaping hole. It's kind of weird that we genuinely have zero front intake fans in this case. I'm sure NZXT could afford to put a third one at the front of this case to help things out a little bit. What we do have though is a nice bracket which we can remove, install our fans on and our radiators too, then place it back in and tighten it down with just 2 thumb screws. If you want to upgrade the fan in the basement, it's a little bit tedious. You'll first have to remove this front bracket, then remove 2 screws on the side of the shroud in the basement, then just wiggle and pull around to get it out. Then you will finally have access to the screws to unscrew the fan. Then just do all that backwards to put it back together. One thing I was a bit bummed to see was the fact that these fans are only 3-pin DC fans, and they top out at only 1200 RPM. They're honestly pretty quiet fans when going at full speed, but that is to be expected with such a low RPM. I guess I shouldn't be surprised though, considering the price and the fact that somehow NZXT value these at £15 each. Yeah, I have no idea why. Let's quickly run through the compatibility inside the H5 Flow. At the rear of the case, we have room for one 120mm fan. Up top, we can fit 2 120mm fans. Down below, we have that 120mm in the basement, and then at the front, you can fit 2 120 or 2 140mm fans. So as you can expect, radiator compatibility is fairly straightforward. A 280 at the front or a 240 up top. As is usually the way with these regular sized mid-tower cases, if you do install a radiator up top, make sure you plug everything in first that you can. Otherwise it can be a bit of a nightmare as there's minimal room to work. Maximum CPU tower caller height is 165mm, so in theory an NHD 15 or very slightly smaller Dart Rot 4 should fit inside, with them measuring at 165 and 163mm respectively, and maximum GPU clearance is up to 365mm, assuming you don't have a radiator installed at the front. Now let's make our way around to the back of the case and have a look at what cable management looks like in the H5 Flow. And at first glance, it's pretty solid. You get plenty of included Velcro ties and even one on the right hand side for the 8-pin CPU cables. You never get them. That's a nice touch. I'll be honest though, Velcro ties are super cheap, so it's the least you should expect. But I just feel like the older method on the H510 with their cable channels was much cleaner, though I think that extra has been left for the more premium H7 line of cases now. We also get these folded pieces of steel on the back to help you tuck your cables under, which is different, but I guess it kind of works, as it will stop rogue cables sticking out when trying to put the side panel back on. Whilst this might not be the most intuitive design we've ever seen, it's simple, it works, and I had absolutely no issues whatsoever. The only thing you might have issues with is down in the basement of the H5 Flow, as we no longer have the hard drive cage to stuff our excess cables from the power supply. If you're using a non-modular power supply, this can be pretty annoying. You could just remove the front fan to gain that extra room down the bottom, but it would just kind of defeat the point of grabbing the H5 Flow in the first place. I guess it's time for the most important part. Let's take a look at the thermals in the NZXT H5 Flow. In the default state, our CPU topped out at just 78 degrees. Not too bad considering it doesn't really have any intake fans. The GPU meanwhile sits around 64 degrees, which is a little high considering we have that dedicated fan blasting straight at it. Funnily enough, if you move that basement fan to the front of the case, this actually improved thermals overall. The CPU temperature dropped from 78 to 76.5 degrees, and the GPU temperature also decreased from 64 to 63.1. I mean, it's not much overall, but it's kind of funny to see that the stock fan down the bottom is better served at the front by default. Though if you do add 2 140mm fans like what you'd expect with the RGB version, obvious disclaimer, the fans I used aren't the exact same, so performance won't be the exact same as that version, but if you put the 120mm back in the basement and have those 2 intake fans, you will see a decent drop in temperatures overall. Compared to the default state, the CPU dropped from 78 to 75.1 degrees, and the GPU dropped from 64 to 61.1 degrees. Conclusion time. How does the NZXT H5 Flow stack up compared to the cases I've tested recently? Well, in its default state, the H5 Flow performs marginally better than the 4000D Airflow, but offers similar results when both cases are populated with fans. If you want to take the confusion out of shopping, the NZXT H5 Flow RGB isn't a bad option, as it comes with two ARGB fans for about £100 to £110, which prices it at a similar price point to that of the Corsair 3000D RGB I checked out. Performance was more or less the same, but funnily enough, the NZXT H5 Flow has the highest GPU temperatures out of all the cases I've recently tested. If you've seen Optimum Tech's recent video called I Fixed PC Cooling, honestly it's worth your time to watch it all, trust me. He showed that the idea of the H5 Flow is good but basically flawed, as the majority of that airflow is lost to the rest of the case, before it can really affect the GPU at all, and to be honest, it makes sense. Though I'd say the biggest issue with the H5 Flow's revolutionary new design is partly the design, partly the choice of fan, and partly just the physical distance of how far away the fan is compared to the GPU. If you have a humongous 4-slot GPU, then you'll obviously be closer to that fan, but compared to where the front intake fans are situated, you're still pretty far away. As well as the surface area from which the fan can even draw air in, down at the bottom, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. You'd be much better with just a brute force approach from the front, and some actual ventilation at the rear of the case. This is why the NZXT H5 Flow RGB makes a bit more sense, as it has ventilated expansion slots, unlike the regular H5 Flow, which is just bonkers. Clearly NZXT are trying to upsell you to that more expensive RGB version, which is why you'll see in tons of the pictures for the H5 Flow Standard Edition it being equipped with RGB fans, even though they're not included. But long story short, do I recommend this case? Yes, of course I do. The design is so simple and boring, it's almost elegant. Everything about it just screams clean and minimal. There's very little wrong here, especially at £75. And it can accommodate all of the latest hardware. The special GPU fan is kinda pointless in its stock configuration, but if you spend the extra money to grab a high performance fan, it'll likely make a big difference. Anyway guys, that brings us to the end of the video. What do you guys think? Is this case likely to be the home of your next PC build, or is it just a bit too plain? If you'd like me to check out any other good PC cases, please let me know down in the comment section below. And if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like as well. And if my face hasn't offended you, don't forget to get subscribed. If you're interested in checking out the NZXT H5 Flow or any extras I may have mentioned, make sure you check the description for my Amazon affiliate links. I'll catch you in the next one guys. Cheers.